All right, folks, just showing the answer real quick here to the opening question. We included a code excerpt in the email, but the occupant load for this facility was 216 people. And now we're going to pass it over to Ben Norkin to present on some things to know about the 2021 IBC. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you guys for having me. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, but I'm Ben from Hyperfine website. So some of you guys have probably read my blog or seen my YouTube or used some of my study material that I wrote. But tonight I'm talking about 2 to 3 things that you should know about the IBC, maybe the level of understanding you need. And Amber Book asked me to talk about occupant load and occupancy. And looks like some people have a sound issue. Maybe I should just stay out of chat. So topics for tonight are going to be use and occupancy. We'll talk about the general classifications, what are use groups, where to find them. We'll talk about incidental versus accessory. Then we'll talk about occupant load, which is not really related to use and occupancy. That was the opening question that you guys got. I don't know when it got sent out to you and when you're supposed to do that work, but occupant load is related to people in the building, but it's not the same as use and occupancy. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about net versus gross, and then I wrote up another short exercise for you guys to do, similar to the one that Matt just went over, and then talk quickly about separated occupancies and how to read table 508.4, which is the fire separation. So 2 references for this. Most of this is directly from the 2021 IBC, which you can find from Google if you don't have it. I also didn't put the link here. I highly recommend subscribing to the IBC code commentary. I think it's in the range of like $12 a month, and it has plain language explanations of it all and extra problems and samples. It's straight from the IBC. Their website is not great. It takes a little while to find and subscribe to it, but that's a good reference. And then I have a post on my site, which the link is here, which is things to know about the IBC for the ARE 5.0. It's maybe 10 to 12 topics with a real brief description of the general things you should know about those. And then that should be maybe a springboard for you guys to learn those topics a little bit more in depth. But the thing with the IBC is it's huge, and I'm probably going to repeat myself a ton of times tonight. But you do not have to memorize this stuff. You have to understand the intent of the code. You should understand what these concepts are: use and occupancy, occupant load, separated occupancies, and various other topics. You should know where to find it, because in most exams, you're going to be given an excerpt of the code, but you don't have to memorize fire separations and values and exactly what use group goes in what, occupancy group. Next slide, please. So we'll start use and occupancy. This is the classification. This is in italics. This is the quote straight from the IBC. It's the classification is the formal designation of the primary purpose of the building or the portion thereof. This is from 302.1. So you find this stuff in chapter 3. This is a pretty important chapter to know for the exam, just to know where it is, know what's in it, know how to sort of navigate through it. But when you hear about use groups like B for like business or residential or assembly, these are use groups that apply to the whole building or a portion of the building if it's mixed use or some other type of building that has multiple occupancies in it. And this is something that's going to come up again and again as you are trying to figure out maybe the maximum building height or the maximum building area or fire separation, if that's required, or spaces with one exit, and various other things in the code will be determined, or the determination of other things in the code will be based on what occupancy your building is. Now, when we talk about use and occupancy, this is not occupant load, which is how many people can go in a certain space, and we'll talk about that next. So this is use and occupancy. This is broadly defining what a building or part of the building is used for. This is just a sort of cut and paste from my blog, but you don't need to memorize these sort of next slides I'm going to go through. Again, you don't need to memorize every single use that is in assembly 1, 2, 3, and 4, and same thing R1, R2, R3. It's good to have a general understanding so you know when you're presented with a scenario, sort of what the question might be asking you, but you don't have to memorize the entire list. And we'll see in a little bit that there is some overlap where certain things could be in multiple occupancies. So just understand generally that buildings are classified by what happens in them, whether it's assembly, business, educational, factory, hazardous storage or non-hazardous storage, or if it's a jail or all kinds of things, right? So buildings are generally classified that way. And if this is super basic stuff to you, that's good. But a lot of us, myself included, are not IBC architects. I do single family residential. A lot of you guys probably don't do IBC projects, and that's okay. You just have to know, understand the intent of the code, how to work within the code, how to read it, and how to find the information you're looking for. Next slide, please. So these are the summary of the different occupancy classifications. So again, don't memorize, just understand how this stuff is broken down. So assembly is occupancies where people gather. So these are things like theaters, restaurants, clubs, libraries, museums. That list right there could be in any of these ones. So assembly, you can see it's further broken down into A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. You don't have to memorize all that. Business, this is professional services, so not sales, but things like architecture offices, post offices, macro data refinement, things where, like white collar work is happening is B in business. And there's only one, it's not broken up between B1, B2, and so on. Educational is E. This is schools, kindergarten through 12, because colleges and above sometimes could be business or they could be assembly. It depends. Then there's factory and industrial, which is assembly, fabricating, manufacturing, deconstruction. I don't think you're going to see that too much on the exam. There's high hazard, which is manufacturing, but stuff that constitutes a physical or health hazard. The code, the entire point of the code is to protect life and safety. So a lot of times the code is broken up. A lot of times the code is broken up into things that are more and less hazardous. So you can see over on the right column, we've got storage. So this is just what it sounds like, but it's storage of stuff that's more safe than the stuff that's stored in high hazard. So furniture, clothing, tobacco, meats, metals, appliances, things that you store. Theoretically, they could catch fire. Within storage, there's S1 and S2. Again, you don't have to memorize this, just understand that these are the way it's broken up. Institutional, I think this is another one that's probably not going to come up on the exam, but this is where people live who are not capable or allowed to take care of themselves, like hospitals or jails or detox or assisted living facilities, which you can see is also in residential. So residential is places where people live. They could be transient, like hotels and motels. They could be long-term, like apartments. They could be various other things, dorms, frats and sororities, that type of thing. And so you can see residential is again broken up R1, R2, R3, R4, based on how transient or how permanent people live there, and how maybe dangerous it is, or the theoretical hazards that you might encounter. Usually the code assumes that people who are more permanent in nature are less hazardous than people who are staying in a place that they don't maybe know as well. We can probably talk about that in a little bit. Mercantile, this is M, this is stores. So what we call retail or shopping is mercantile. And then utility and miscellaneous is any place that somehow doesn't fit into all these other categories. My personal opinion is you're not super likely to see factory, industrial, high hazard, institutional, or miscellaneous on the exam. And the second bullet point here is that some uses are listed in multiple groups, like assisted living facilities. On the exam, you only have 2.5 minutes to answer a question. And the test writers know this, which is why you're never going to have to, I think, make a determination about whether an assisted living facility should be I1 or R3 or whatever they are, right? You're not going to have to make these super nuanced decisions that take a lot of time in the real world. You're going to have to know the difference between a theater and an apartment building, or a school and storage, something like that. You're going to have to know that these are very, very different things that have different uses, and they probably need some type of separation, or that there's some code implications with different things happening in these spaces. Next, please. So like I said, use and occupancy is going to relate to other code sections, very specifically to how much you're allowed to build. So here is table 504.3 that shows the allowable building height in feet. And you can see, if you look in the occupancy classification over on the column on the left, a lot of them are grouped together. Like, they're grouped together based on general safety of that general use of these spaces. And you can see that they lump all of A together, and all of F together, and all of S and all of R are sort of together on the same line, even though we just saw, and we'll see in the future, that A is broken up between A1 through 5, F is F1 and 2, and so on. So in some cases, all of them get grouped together, and in some cases, they're split up. So next slide, please. So then here on the number of stories, so the one we just saw was the allowable building height, but there's also limits on the number of stories. And for some reason, that is broken up differently. So each A classification, A1 through A5, has a slightly different allowable number of stories. And you can see this table is broken up by the individual subgroups. Next, please. And then one more table that we're going to come back to in more detail about how to read this one, but this is the fire separation of occupancies for a mixed use building. And again, this one is kind of split. You can see that assembly and residential are all lumped together, but then things like the H, the high hazard, and the storage are split up separately. So it could be either way. So again, you don't have to memorize these things. You have to understand the implication of the use group and how you might use that information later. Next, please. Okay, so this is, I'm going to summarize some of the more important use groups you're going to see. More important to know where this stuff is in the code than to memorize it. And let's see my notes real quick. Yep, so A1, performing arts, movies, theaters, concert halls, theaters twice for some reason. A2 is food and drink, so restaurants, nightclubs, bars, taverns. 3 is churches and synagogues, art galleries, bowling alleys, courtrooms, libraries, museums. 4 says in the code for viewing. I don't know if that also includes the doing of indoor sports, arenas, skating rinks, swimming pools. And then 5 is participating in or viewing outdoor activities, amusement park structures, bleachers, stadiums, right? You're not going to have to memorize that a stadium is A5 and that a restaurant is A3, but you will have to, when you get a question, you will have to, sort of like pause and say, okay, well, what is happening? What is the, what's going on with the occupancy in this building? What's happening here, and how might that affect my answer on maybe fire separation, maybe allowable area, allowable height, that type of stuff. I see some comments in the chat about you're guided by the most stringent use. That yes and no, we'll get to that in a little bit. But use and occupancy is chapter 3. So assembly is section 303. So I highly recommend reading this chapter of the code to see what is in here, so you can more on the exam be more familiar with sort of like looking through it and finding the information you want. I did not have any of this memorized on the exam. If you go in maybe generally knowing the difference between A1, A2, and A3, that might help, but don't think you have to memorize that list I just read. Next, please. Okay, so I put business, mercantile, and education all on the same one, but business, just keep in mind, is for professional services, white collar stuff, offices. Mercantile is what we might think of as business, but it's retail, it's sales. And the code treats mercantile a little bit more strictly than it does business for a couple reasons. Is one, like there might be the things for sale are stored there, could be dangerous or flammable. You could have possibly larger crowds going to a shopping mall than to, your office, your CPA office. The people going there are probably less familiar. So if you go to the same office every day and the same people work there, they're familiar with the building. But if you have shoppers coming in and it's a different crowd every weekend, they might be less familiar with the layout. And these kind of things, the code interprets to meaning you need maybe more space or more exits or more fire separation. And then educational is by 6 or more persons at a time for educational purposes through the 12th grade. So it's really up through high school. I don't think you're going to get a question on the exam, be like, here's a school for 5 people. What occupancy is it? And then they're going to be like, oh, we tricked you because you need 6, educational doesn't start till 6. Like that's not the kind of thing that's on the exam. So this is not the kind of thing that I would memorize, right? But you should know a school is for learning. That seems like educational, and maybe that cannot be built directly next to the high hazard storage, facility. Another thing to note is that in the code, things like cafeterias, gymnasium, libraries may be classified as A because they are A, but if they're also part of the school, they might be classified as E. This is the kind of thing that I think probably has a lot of debate and a lot of code implications, and will take a long time and a lot of back and forth with your local jurisdiction. And so you're not going to have to be able to make that decision in 2.5 minutes on the exam, I don't think. But it's good to know that per the code, those things are allowed to be included in the e-occupancy. And Zara is telling everyone, no, the cafeteria is A, not E, but I think you need to read directly what the code says, which I would guess that most of you have more IBC experience than me. But when I get in arguments with people about things I've said on my site or in my courses, it's 100% of the time them telling me what happens in their local jurisdiction or what they've done in their last project, and not what's written in black and white in the code, which is why people like myself can pass these exams even when we don't have experience. So you can do it too. Just make sure you're reading the code. Your experience is super valuable and helpful, but you also have to read exactly what's in the book. Next, please. Okay, summary of residential. So it's going basically from most transient to less transient. So R1 is hotels, motels. That's basically all I would sort of know or remember. R2 is permanent, more than 2 dwelling units, which is apartments or dorms. And then R3 is permanent 2 or fewer dwelling units. And then R4 is, I don't even know what this is, 5 and 16 people, not including staff, who reside and supervise 24 hours a day. You do not have to memorize that. Just know that residential info is in chapter 3. It's in section 310. Understand that there is a difference. Understand that there's a difference between places that people live and how long they stay there. So if you come to a question that talks about an apartment versus a motel, there could be a difference of allowable area or height or fire separation or something like that. But you don't have to memorize these things. If you can know off the top of your head, there's a difference between R1 and R2, you'll be better off for it. Next, please. Okay, so here's one that might come up that people talk about all the time. There's something called incidental use and accessory occupancies. And these are one of the various types of mixing. These are various types of mixing uses within a building, because most buildings are not just one thing, they serve multiple purposes. So incidental, I think we'll cover first, and it is probably, I don't know which one's more or less likely, but incidental uses, this is the definition, are ancillary functions associated with a given occupancy that generally pose a greater level of risk for that occupancy. So ancillary means subordinate or secondary or auxiliary or assisting. And so incidental uses are support spaces like furnace or machinery rooms or large laundry rooms or storage. This is not stuff like cafes in a food court or kiosks in a mall and stuff like that, right? These are like utility sort of workspaces. And a couple things to know is that they do not have their own occupancy classification. So if you have an assembly building with like a furnace room, that furnace room is not classified separately. It does have its own occupant load. So when we talk next about occupant load, about the people who are allowed in a certain space, or the egress you have to provide for people in a space, that is separate. They must, so incidental use must be separated or must be provided with fire separation. There's a table 509.1. And actually, I forgot to mention that this table 509.1 lists the only, it's, I don't know, 15 or 20 long, but it's the only things that are allowed to be incidental uses. And it's limited to 10% of the floor area on the floor they're located. So you might have that number memorized. So incidental uses, the thing to keep in mind is sort of this 4 bullet points is that they're more hazardous than the general occupancy in which they're more hazardous than the occupancy which they reside in. They do have to be fire separated, but they don't need their own occupancy classifications. Next, please. All right, so the next one is accessory occupancy. So it's incidental use or incidental use and accessory occupancy. So an accessory occupancy is very similar in that an occupancy that's secondary or subordinate to the main occupancy of the building or that portion, but they're different and in support of. So incident or accessory occupancy does have its own occupancy classification. It does have its own occupant load, but it does not require fire separation. And it is also limited to 10% of the floor area or the non-sprinkler tabular area from 506.2, which we're not really covering today, but when you talk about building height, there's various tables that you pull values from, and the non-sprinklered number comes up in a couple different places in the code. And I'm pretty sure I covered that in the post on my site that was linked earlier. What I don't understand, maybe one of you guys that does more IBC, I never understood why it does need its own occupancy classification, but does not require fire separation, as opposed to the other one, incidental use, which does not need to be separately classified, but does need to be fire separated. So maybe if someone knows that and puts in the chat, you can see this is the level of IBC knowledge I passed the exams with. So if you guys are ahead of me, then you're in a good spot. Next, please. All right, so here are 4 or 5 important occupancy terms to know. Principal occupancy, that's what we've been talking about. It's the main occupancy of a space or a building. This is in chapter 3, assembly, business, residential, all those things I was talking about. Accessory occupancy, it's a different occupancy that's in support of the principal occupancy. It's classified separately, but does not require fire separation. It's limited to 10%. Incidental use, which is it's like accessory occupancy, but it's a more hazardous occupancy that's in support of the main one. It's not separately classified, but it does need its own fire separation, and it's also limited to 10% of the floor area. These 2 things might come up on the exam. Then you've got non-separated and separated occupancies. And this one probably a lot of people don't really know about. So different occupancies, non-separated occupancies are different occupancies that share a building with no fire separation. There's no 10% limit, but the total height and area of a building is limited to the most restrictive of the 2. So my code note down here is that the code dictates some things, like it dictates the maximum riser height or the width of the egress or some things that you have to follow that. But there's other things where it gives you the option of choosing to build in a different way or choosing more or less safety. So you can choose sprinklers or not. And this does not get you out of requirements from your state or your local jurisdiction. It doesn't get you out of requirements from other sections of the code. But when you're talking about occupancy, building size, and area, you are allowed to do non-separated occupancies. You can say, we're not doing partitions, we're not doing fire rated partitions in between these occupancies. The result is you are going to be restricted to the smallest height and area of the different occupancies. So if it's like business and storage or, residential and storage, and some of these, I don't know these numbers off the top of my head, so maybe they're not required anyway. But if you say, yes, we are going to separate these occupancies with fire walls and partitions and barriers, then we are allowed to build more. And so often that is the choice that's made to develop a project to the height and area that you want to. But the code does not just flat out say you have to separate these occupancies. That's a choice you make. So that you're allowed to build more stuff. And so non-separated occupancies, like it sounds, it's a building with multiple occupancies that are not fire separated. And then separated occupancies are probably what everyone is most familiar with when they're thinking about this concept. It's multiple occupancies in a building that are fire separated, allowing the building to be built bigger and more area. Yeah, and I see a comment from Hannah here. I don't do very much commercial work, but I've done a couple small projects in the past that are small enough that we did not have to do fire separation because the most restrictive of the mercantile versus the business still let us do the allowable, the floor area we needed. So you don't always have to do it, but it's, you put sprinklers in the building, you're allowed to build more. So people do it. Next, please. Okay, so that was use and occupancy. That's general big picture stuff about how the building is used. Occupant load is a similar name, but it's not really related because it's not a one-to-one translation. So occupant load is a measure of how many people are in a space. And the important thing here, which helps me understand it better, is that it's not how many people you're allowed to have in a space, it's how many people you have to provide egress for. And so what the code doesn't want is for you to build a giant assembly room and say, yeah, but only like 5 people are going to be in here, so we just have this one little egress door. What it says is if you build a space that's 1,000 square feet, you have to come to this table and find out how many people could theoretically be in there, and then you have to provide egress for that many people. And we'll talk about that more in a minute because this is one of the things you round up in the code. And I have a blog for that too. I think that I put the link in here in a little bit. So occupant load, quick explanation, is the number of people for which you have to provide egress for from a space. It is not a one-to-one relationship. It's not business, assembly, residential. When we look at the table in a minute, you can see that there's 50 different things and they could be in various different occupancies. Next, please. Okay, so this is the table. 1004, I think .6 or 5. I can't read it on this small little print, but so this is in chapter 10, which is egress, right? So everything before was chapter 3, which was defining stuff. This is now egress. And the two things you're going to sort of have to know between is floor area gross and floor area net. Again, you just have to go to the code, go to chapter 2 and read the definitions of these things. And there's no confusion about what they are and where they're measured from. But floor area gross is measured from the inside face of the exterior walls. Looks like I have a problem where I mispasted some of the stuff there, but this is from the code and or the code commentary, but it's measured from the inside face of the exterior walls. You do subtract shafts and chases, so mechanical shafts, elevators, stuff like that. You do not subtract hallways, columns, and wall thicknesses. Floor area net is probably easier for us to understand. This is the actual occupied area, usually within a room, measured typically from the inside face of the walls. So a couple things. One, don't confuse gross floor area with similar terms that might be used in zoning. And I have a post on my, oh yeah, right there. I've got that post on my site as well. Gross floor area explained if you want to read more about this. But gross floor area can come up in different, in different parts of the project. My local jurisdiction uses that term or a very similar term for zoning, and it's measured to the outside face exterior walls. And through talking with lots of you, I know some jurisdictions do that as a code amendment as well. But per the IBC, gross floor area is measured to the inside perimeter of the walls. Just try to keep in mind that the code is concerned with life safety and allowing people to get out of a building. And so they care about the space that could be occupied, whereas zoning cares about massing and access to light and green space and things like that, which is why they might measure the outside face. So just know that gross sort of encompasses hallways, wall thicknesses. You don't really have to subtract these things. And floor area net is really room by room. And then once you have this measurement, you come over to this table, 104.5 or 6, and then find whether it's a net or a gross multiplier, and then or factor, and then you find how many people can go in your space. So we'll do an example next, I think. Next slide, please. here's an exercise I wrote up. The owner of this warehouse is using the A201 and the B201. There's a beautiful lake on the site with a 40-foot easement around it. Geotechnical report for the soil on the remaining part of the site is still pending. Local zoning laws dictate a specific exterior siding for new structures in this zone. Considering wind bracing, building height, and the zoning requirements, the exterior walls shown here are 12 inches thick. What is the occupant load for this project? Is this clear enough for you guys to even be able to see? I don't want to put anyone on this spot here. The next one's easier. So I guess if people can get the PowerPoint, maybe you can come to this one later. But basically, the point of this exercise was to, one, try to discern what information here is actually useful, and then two, try to determine the difference between like gross and net. I'll tell you a trick on this one. This entire thing is gross. So let's go. We'll look at the answer on this one, and then maybe you guys can practice the next one. So from the exercise, all of that was just nonsense, which is, probably what you're going to see on the exam, a ton of words that are not all super valuable. And I know that Amber Book sort of set up the same thing on the one that they did at the beginning of the beginning. So there's a warehouse, which is in that table. Let me actually look it up over here myself. And you can see my math over here. So 500 gross. So basically, the entire thing was 120 feet by 60 feet. You have to subtract a little area down here because it's not in the footprint. You have to subtract the elevator. That works out to 6,064 square feet. The warehouse is a 500 gross factor. So you take 6,064, divide by 500, you get 12.128. You round up to 13. So I know that was not a super helpful exercise. Maybe the next one will be a little bit better, but if you're coming back to this later, just keep in mind, occupant load is the thing that has to be rounded up. And I've got a thing on a post on my site also about whether to round up or down for various code requirements. And there is some leeway on the exams. About when you type in numbers or choose a number, but it's good to sort of do things right and to know which code things have to be rounded up or down. This is an instance where we round up, and if we go into the code and find the egress distance and things like that, there's probably not a difference between 12 or 13 people. But the point to keep in mind is that this occupant load calculation is a calculation of how much egress you are supposed to provide for people. So if it's 12.128 and you round down to 12 and you only provide egress for 12 people, then you haven't provided enough because you have that, 1/8 of a person just about. Yes, this is what happens when you sort of write an example, but don't back check with the code. So yes, you only need to provide egress for 13 people, but if we were to actually do this calculation, a lot of them are in inches, like, 0.2 inches per person or 0.15. And it depends on if it's like a door or a corridor or whatever. And if you end up, a lot of times you're going to end up with a small number, like a door that only has to be 15 inches wide, then you're going to get bumped up to other minimums. But that is not what this course is about tonight. All right, next one, please. Okay, very similar building, but this one's a complete square. Omid, we did subtract that elevator on the last one. You can take a look later when you get the slides from Amber Book. So this groundbreaking net zero facility is framed with heavy timber and 12-inch thick rammed earth walls. The architect was able to get a code exception in order to classify the entire facility as educational, allowing the owner to finance the project with a publicly funded bond to be repaid over 30 years. The parking lot must be expanded to account for future development on the site, including mixed-use residential and high-hazard fuel storage facility. What is the total occupant load? And I don't know if you guys can see it, but this nice big area in the top is blackjack tables. And then there's a hallway with a fire-rated separation wall. And then you got a bunch of daycares. Can I answer in chat? Do you want to spend like 2 minutes trying to do this? Or do you want me to just go to answer? Is there any way to zoom in? I know it's already probably in like presentation mode, but it's 120 wide by 60 tall. The walls are 12 inches thick. The daycare on the left is 38.5 by 19. The 3 daycares in the middle are 19 by 19. And the 1 daycare on the right is 18.5 by 19. All right, let's do 45 more seconds. All right, can you go to the next slide, please, and show my work? Yeah, the code commentary. It's a book. It's the code, but it comes with basically explanations of everything. And now it's all online as well, so you can subscribe to it. You just need volume 1 because the code comes in 2 volumes, but volume 1 covers basically everything you need to know. So, all right, from this exercise, the only thing that matters is that the walls are 12 inches thick, and then the other information is in the drawing. Whereas in the previous one, the only thing you knew is that it was a warehouse, and it had all different rooms, but they weren't labeled or anything. So all you knew from that was a warehouse. This one, all that writing, the only thing you need to know is that the walls are 12 inches thick. And so the way I did it was I found the blackjack and gaming area, which was the entire top area and including the hallway, because no, looking in the table over here, that is assembly gaming floors, which is a gross. So I knew I needed to find a gross square footage. So it was 120 by 40, and I subtracted a foot from each side because of the wall thickness. And I got 118 by 38, which is 4,484 gross square feet. I look in the table 1004.5, and I see that gaming floors are 11 gross. So I divide that 4,000 by 11. I get 407.636, and I round that up to 408. And I saw this question in the QA, but I think you probably find each individual one and then round up to find the sum, because you can have a mix of gross and net, and you don't want to sort of combine the calculations. So then the daycares are the daycare rooms with no doors or windows. You sort of do those individually. It's the same process. So the one on the left ends up being 38.5 by 19, which is 731.5 square feet. If you come over to the table, daycares are in here at 35 net. So that's why I used a net calculation, and sort of you have to go to the table first. I guess the process is look at the drawing, see what what do they call it in here? See what function of the space you think it is, and then do the calculation. So I can't just like start off doing a gross or net calculation. I need to know what my end goal is first. And the question is that has nothing to do with the occupancy classification of the entire facility. I think that's correct, because you can see there's various things in here that are listed very specifically by the function and not by the accessory and by the use. And so maybe gaming floors are always going to be assembly spaces. I don't know, but it's not really part of the calculation. You can do it completely independently of knowing what the use group is. So again, you have to look at the drawing, you have to read the scenario, see what function you think these spaces are, and then find it. Let me go through the rest of the math, and I'll come back to these answers. So anyway, the daycares then are a net calculation. So you can see my math here. The one on the left is 38.5 by 19, works out to 20.9, which I round up to 21. The 3 in the middle are the same. So that worked out to 10.3, which rounds up to 11. And then the one on the right is a little bit smaller, but still rounds up to 11. You add all that stuff up, and I got 462. Gross is, why did I exclude the walls? Gross is measured to the inside face of the walls. So I measured from the inside face of the exterior walls, and I did not subtract the corridor wall right here that's sort of hidden in the yellow. And I measured to the inside face of the firewall, because we're measuring inside face of walls. I maybe the hallway counts as the daycare. I tried to say that that hallway is the fire separation to show that that's where the separation between the occupancies was, and that the hallway was part of the part that you're going to be using for the gross. Next, please. Okay. I think this slide should have been earlier, or maybe I was taking my notes, but again, 4 basic methods of separating occupancies. Oh, that's right. We're starting to talk about fire separation now. That's right. I only have like 2 or 3 slides left on fire separation. But so now we're back to occupancies, not occupant load. So now we're back to big picture stuff about general uses. So if you have a building that has more than one occupancy in it, there are 4 basic methods. There's accessory occupancies, which we talked about, which are secondary. They have their own classification and they're limited to 10% of the floor area. They're not separated. You've got non-separated occupancies, which we talked about are not separated, and they're not limited to 10%, but the entire project is limited to the smallest height area of those different occupancies. You have separated occupancies, which is the big one, which you're probably going to encounter on the exam, where you have to figure out a fire separation, and your reward for doing this is you're allowed to build more stuff. And then you've got live work units, which I have no idea what it is. And I saw that and I was like, I'm not even gonna try to learn what this is. But when you read the code, section 508 deals with multiple occupancies. And so that's where this stuff is all coming from. So 508.4 is the big one that you're gonna have to get more familiar with in the code. Next slide, please. And in 508, it's got this table 508.4, which is super important to know for the code, which tells you the required separation of occupancies if you want to take advantage of being able to build more height and more area of each of these things. So I'm going to go through all the different sort of things that are in this code, all the different things that are in this table here. So next slide, please. Before we start, just know that it doesn't matter which way you read the code. This is a picture of the same table from 2018. And because the stuff in the bottom half is just replica of the stuff in the top half, they dashed it out. And people kept confusing this with these dashes, meaning either it was not allowed or it was not, or no separation was required. So now in 2021 and later, now in 2021 and later, they just filled out the whole table. So next, please. All right, so you have your occupant group along the top and on the left, because you're gonna have to find where they intersect. So you can see A and E are together, and I1, I3, and I4. So this is one of those ones where the subgroup matters. Within the table, if you see a number, that's the separation in hours. So the one that's pointing at 2, that says that you need a 2-hour separation between an I2 and an A or an E occupancy that has sprinklers. An NP means not permitted, so you cannot have these occupancies together. So you can't have an institutional next to an R, which means you can't have like a jail mixed use building with apartments. An N means no separation required. A lot of times that is groups that are sort of matched with themselves in the table, but there are some other occupancies that don't need separation required. And then as a sort of subnote, if you're looking at these things, you can sort of tell which occupancies the code deems more dangerous. As you can see, the H, if we look at H1 on the left, is not permitted to be next to assembly, even with sprinklers, but H2 is with a 3-hour separation and H5 is with a 2-hour separation. So it's saying like H1's got to be like the most hazardous. And then if you look in the columns, S means yes, it has sprinklers, and NS means no, it does not have sprinklers. So we'll go through and do an example. Next slide, please. So what is the required separation between a theater and an apartment building? Both have sprinklers. So if you don't know the occupancy of a theater and you don't know the occupancy of an apartment building, go to 303 or go to chapter 3 and try to figure out which one it is. And if you can break it down, whether it's like A1 or 2 or 3 and R1 or 2 or 3, that's fine. But as you can see in this table, you don't need to go any further. So don't, if something like this comes up in the test, like don't like overthink it. Once you see that it's an A and an R, then that's all you need, because in this particular case, it doesn't matter if it's A1 and R2. So next, please. All right, so theater is group A, apartment is group R. Next. So it doesn't matter if you start at the left or the top. I always start at the left just because that's where I happen to look first, but it doesn't matter if you do it the opposite way. But we find the A row and we read all the way across. Next, please. We find where that matches with the R. So somewhere in that intersection is going to be our required separation. And then next, and then we choose the one that's sprinklered, right? So we read across from A, we read down from R, and we had two choices. Sprinklered, we have a 1 hour separation. Non-sprinklered, we have a 2 hour separation. So we said this was sprinklered, so we get to choose the 1 hour separation between these occupancies. This is a PPD level question where you might be asked to find this value. And then on PDD, you might be asked to find a wall assembly that can provide this type of 1 hour rating. Next, please. And like I said, the same info is in the other end of the chart. It doesn't matter. So you can see I started with A on the left and found R on the right. If you started with A at the top and found R on the left, it works out the same thing. In the previous version, that bottom left one would have been dashed out. And then some people might have said, oh, there's no, I can't do it. It's not applicable or it's not required or something. So that's table 508.4. I think that might have been my last slide. Yeah. Thank you guys for your comments.
Hey, Ben, we do have someone who's raised their hand.
15 minutes.
If you'll take a question. This is from Natalie.
Sure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for going over some of this. I was just curious, is another good resource I guess the building codes illustrated by Ching, is that a good resource to use or no?
Do you want to say hi? My daughter Natalie is standing directly right here next to me, and she was super excited to see your name. Yeah, Ching is a great resource. Ching, when I say Ching, I think of Building Construction Illustrated, which I think is like the single best book, but Building Code Illustrated is a great one. I reference that one quite a bit. And that's one of the few books that, I always say, like, you don't need the latest version of a book, but except for code and contracts, because those things change. And so, yeah, the Ching book is great. I don't need to keep talking about it. It's a great book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion.
I have the 2021 one, so I guess that I just wanted to know if this is good to use to study for the exam. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If you have that, maybe you don't need the code commentary, but I like to have the code commentary because it's within the code, so I can just click it on or off. And then if I don't understand something, there's like, a plain language sort of explanation right there. And there's also, if you're, once you get more into the mixed use occupancy and the calculations about, the calculations about floor area and stuff like that, they have examples in there that you can sort of follow along and do. So it's one plus for the commentary, which I don't know if is in Ching or not.
Okay, alrighty. Thank you.
I saw this question a couple times, but if you could just talk through, Ben, in those examples you provided, why you exclude the walls.
Sure. Can you go back to one of them?
Absolutely.
So let's look at the first one.
Do you want the answer sheet?
Yeah. So this one was gross. And someone had a tip about like Control Plus or something zooms in.
Oh yeah.
This one was gross. The entire trick of it was that it's a warehouse. So that was the only information you have about what's in this, the function of the space, right? So the occupancy doesn't matter. The function of the space is warehouse. So you have to go to the table 1004.5, find warehouse. You see that it's a 500 gross factor. So now you need to find gross. And so per the IBC, gross is measured to the inside face of exterior walls, and you do subtract chases. So things that people can't occupy, like you can't occupy a mechanical chase, you can't really occupy an elevator, even though, people are in it. So you get credit for places people can't occupy. But you don't have to deal with wall thicknesses, columns, removing columns, stuff like that. So there's some columns in here that I call out size, and there's wall thicknesses, and you just sort of ignore them. That was like the point of this first one, is to sort of do a little math of subtracting this area and subtracting the elevator, and making sure you measure the inside face of the walls. And I saw someone in chat said that they generally measure the outside face of the walls. And if that's what your firm does or your locality does, then that's fine. It's just good to read the code, because per IBC, it's to the inside face of the exterior walls. And then on the second one, it was the same thing. So on this one, you've got two. You've got a gross area, or you got an area that has that's factored with a gross factor, and then an area, some functions that have a net factor. And so the gross, the gaming floor, is measured to the inside face of the exterior walls, and it envelops the hallway partition that's on the gaming floor side. So that hallway I included in the gross because I tried to show that it was separate, or that it was part of the gaming floor, by showing where the fire separation was. So the fire separation is that wall that is in white that you can still see, that's separating the top big rectangle from the small daycares. And so that just is in compliance with the definition of gross. Measure the inside face of exterior walls, and you do not subtract interior partition thicknesses, right? So you just envelop that whole space. You don't have to measure the thickness of that wall and the length of it. So it sort of makes the calculation easier, even though it's working against you if you think of it that way. And then net is usually just the actual usable space. It's pretty easy. So you just sort of measure the inside face of the walls from the thing you're measuring.
I see Ron has his hand raised. Here we go.
Hi, thanks. Ben, I asked a couple times in the chat. You were listing earlier the different ARE classifications and how they were categorized, but I didn't see anything that were for larger size condos. Let's say 20, 50, 150 unit size buildings that are condos or other residential. What ARE category do they fall into?
Let me look that up real quick. I think it's the one that's like 2 or more.
Oh, so it starts as little as 2 or more units? 2 is as much as 200 then?
Yeah, so it's R2 occupancies containing sleeping units or more than 2 dwelling units where occupants are primarily permanent in nature.
Got you. Well then, so let's see. I'm trying to understand.
Because I think it's, I don't know this 100%, but I think because IRC allows you to do duplexes. And so if it's 2 or fewer, you can downgrade to IRC. And that might be where the more than 2 comes from. So it handles basically 3 to an infinite.
Okay.
Because I do duplexes under IRC.
So then let's say if I'm looking at R4, which is between 5 to 16 people, not including staff who reside in a supervised place. So this is more of like assisted living hospital.
Yeah, but you could also, so exactly, like assisted living facility is here in this super obtuse definition, and it could also be institutional. And so if I'm studying, I'm just like going to completely ignore R4. And I talk about this on my site. I'll put this link in the chat actually, because I'm looking at it right now.
Because I read R4 as an institutional.
I have a post about passing scores and what score you need to pass and sort of how that influenced my exam strategy. And the point that I sort of make is that you're allowed to miss a lot of questions. And so you can triage this stuff and you're not going to know everything. And I don't believe you're going to be on the exam asked to make a decision about an assisted living facility, whether it should be R4, I3, and something
Got it.
ridiculous like that. And so if it's me personally, I would get a good handle on R1, R2, R3, know where to find it. And if I like read R4 once, I'm like, forget this. If I get a question on R4, I'll just, say I was unlucky.
So what is the real difference between R2 and R3 then? One, I guess, is apartments or dorms. So then 3 might be the condo scenario though, because it's neither an apartment or dorm.
Like this has dormitories, frats and sororities, like those places don't have, each person living there doesn't have their own kitchen, right? So it's not, so it says like the first one is it does not contain more than 2 dwelling units, because a dwelling unit is its own living place with its own bathroom, its own bedroom, its own kitchen. But a dorm, you don't get your own bathroom.
Oh,
Right.
I missed the word fewer. Okay, one's
Yeah.
more than, the other's fewer than. I got you.
Okie doke.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Unless there's any more questions that you're trying to answer, Ben, I think we can go ahead and thank you for your presentation, and I think everyone really enjoyed it, and yeah, we'll look forward to the next time you join us for 40 Minutes of Competence.
Cool. Well, you guys know where to find me, Ben at hyperfinearchitecture.com, or just go to my website, and a lot of good free information and courses that you guys can get.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good
See
one.
ya.